Nobody in that room realized they were about to witness history. There were no cameras, no audience, no announcer, just two men standing a few feet apart. Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, both already feared, both already respected. But what happened next would turn that respect into legend. Bruce Lee broke the silence first. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply stepped forward. The room changed. People stopped breathing. Eyes locked in. Every instinct said something dangerous was about to unfold. Chuck Norris didn't move. He didn't need to. He had built his reputation on power, on dominance, on finishing fights. Bruce Lee was different. He wasn't known for intimidation. He didn't flex. He didn't posture. He observed. Then Bruce Lee looked Chuck Norris straight in the eyes and said something so calm, so controlled, that it unsettled everyone watching. Let's find out what really works. No insult. No challenge filled with ego. Just truth. That single sentence hit harder than a punch. Because Bruce Lee wasn't asking for a fight. He was questioning everything. Styles, beliefs, limits. Chuck Norris smiled, but it wasn't arrogance. It was recognition. Two masters. One moment. No excuses. The energy in the room was heavy, uncomfortable, electric. People expected shouting. They expected aggression. Instead, they got silence. A silence so loud it felt dangerous. This wasn't about winning. This wasn't about dominance. This was about reality. About whose understanding of combat was deeper, sharper, more refined. And in that moment, everyone watching understood one thing. Whatever happened next, martial arts would never be the same again. No one spoke after Bruce Lee's words. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. Chuck Norris shifted his weight slightly. Not nervous, not aggressive. Ready? He had faced champions before. Men bigger than him, stronger than him. But Bruce Lee wasn't built like those men. He stood relaxed, almost casual, hands loose, shoulders low. Yet something about him made the room uneasy. Bruce wasn't preparing to attack. He was preparing to respond. That difference mattered. Chuck Norris raised his guard slowly, not to threaten, but to acknowledge what stood in front of him. This wasn't ego. This was respect. They began to circle. Every step deliberate. Every movement measured. No wasted energy. No unnecessary motion. Observers expected sudden violence. Instead, they witnessed discipline in its purest form. Bruce Lee moved first. Not forward, but sideways. A small shift, almost invisible. Chuck noticed instantly. He adjusted, mirrored the movement, testing distance. Bruce smiled faintly. Not because he was confident, but because he was curious. Curiosity was Bruce Lee's greatest weapon. He wasn't trying to overpower Chuck Norris. He was trying to understand him. Seconds passed, then more seconds. Each moment stretched. Bruce feinted. A quick twitch of the shoulder. Chuck reacted immediately. Too immediately. Bruce didn't strike. He learned. Another feint. Another reaction. Bruce was mapping timing. Speed. Habit. Chuck realized it too. And now it was his turn. Chuck stepped in with controlled pressure. Not a strike. Just presence. Bruce retreated half a step. Light. Effortless. Their footwork told a story no words could explain. Chuck's strength demanded space. Bruce's speed created it. This wasn't chaos. It was conversation. A silent dialogue between two masters. Suddenly movement. A flash. A blur. Hands met. Contact was made. Blocked. Redirected. Neutralized. Not violently. Cleanly. So fast that some people swore they imagined it. They separated again. Both men paused. Neither breathing hard. Neither shaken. But both understanding something new. This wasn't about who could hit harder. It was about who could adapt faster. Bruce Lee lowered his stance slightly. Chuck Norris adjusted his angle. Two warriors, evolving in real time. The room remained silent, not out of fear, but awe, because everyone watching now understood. They weren't witnessing a fight. They were witnessing mastery in motion. And the most important moment hadn't happened yet. Time seemed to slow. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris stood facing each other, no more than a few steps apart. The tension in the room wasn't fear anymore. It was reverence. Both men had tested each other without throwing a real strike. Both had learned. Both had adjusted. And now, something had changed. Bruce Lee straightened slightly, his eyes sharp but calm. He wasn't smiling anymore. Chuck Norris noticed. This was no longer exploration. This was understanding. Chuck shifted his stance, not forward, not back, but grounded, balanced, rooted. Bruce inhaled slowly, then exhaled. In that breath, everything became clear. Bruce Lee wasn't interested in defeating Chuck Norris. He was interested in truth. He stepped in not fast, not slow, perfectly timed. Chuck responded instantly. Hands moved, feet adjusted, energy collided. But instead of explosion, there was control. Bruce's movement flowed like water. Chuck's defense stood like stone. Strike met block. Block turned to redirection. Redirection dissolved into space. Each exchange lasted less than a heartbeat, yet carried years of discipline. Observers couldn't keep up. All they saw were fragments. A shoulder turn, a step, a shift of balance. But what mattered wasn't what they saw. It was what they felt. This wasn't brutality. This wasn't dominance. This was two philosophies meeting. Chuck Norris pressed forward with measured force. Bruce yielded just enough, never giving ground, never resisting fully. Strength met efficiency. Power met precision. Then suddenly, Bruce stopped. Completely. Hands lowered. Posture relaxed. Chuck froze. Not because he was confused, but because he understood. Silence returned. Bruce Lee looked at Chuck Norris and nodded. A small nod, almost invisible. But Chuck nodded back. That was it. No winner declared. No loser exposed. Just recognition. Later, Chuck Norris would speak about that moment with absolute honesty. He said Bruce Lee was the fastest, most controlled, most intelligent martial artist he had ever encountered. Not because Bruce tried to prove superiority, but because he didn't need to. Bruce Lee believed something few truly understand. Real power doesn't demand victory. It reveals itself. That moment wasn't about who would fall. It was about what would rise. From that encounter came friendship, training, mutual respect. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris didn't leave as rivals. They left as students of each other. And martial arts was never the same again. Because Bruce Lee challenged more than Chuck Norris. He challenged tradition, rigid thinking, the idea that strength must look a certain way. He proved that adaptability beats force, that awareness beats aggression, that control beats chaos. That's why the story survived. Not because of a knockout, not because of blood or ego, but because two masters chose understanding over pride. And that choice became legend. Legends aren't made by winning fights. They're made by mastering themselves. If you believe Bruce Lee redefined what real strength, the encounter didn't end when Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris stepped apart. In many ways, that was when it truly began. Because what happened in that room traveled far beyond those walls. It traveled through dojos, through film, through generations. People who heard the story expected drama. They wanted to know who won, who dominated, who proved superiority. But that question missed the point. Bruce Lee never cared about winning a moment. He cared about evolving a system. At the time, martial arts were rigid, locked inside tradition, bound by rules that rarely changed. Styles didn't adapt. They defended themselves. Bruce Lee challenged that thinking. What people saw with Chuck Norris was not a fight. It was a demonstration of freedom. Freedom from fixed stances. Freedom from predictable responses. Freedom from ego. Bruce believed a fighter should be like water, able to flow, able to change, able to become whatever the moment required. Chuck Norris understood that immediately. That's why there was no resentment, no rivalry, only respect. Chuck came from discipline built on structure and power. Bruce came from a discipline built on movement and efficiency. When those worlds met, neither collapsed. They expanded. After that moment, training was no longer about proving whose style was better. It became about asking better questions. What works? Why does it work? And when does it fail? That mindset changed everything. Bruce Lee went on to influence not just martial artists, but thinkers, athletes, actors, leaders. People who had never thrown a punch began to quote him. Absorb what is useful. Reject what is useless. Add what is essentially your own. That philosophy wasn't born in theory. It was proven in moments like the one with Chuck Norris. And Chuck carried that lesson forward too. Years later, when people asked him about Bruce Lee, he didn't speak of competition. He spoke of clarity, of speed, of intelligence. He spoke of a man who understood combat at its deepest level. That's why this story endures. Not because it's loud, but because it's honest. In a world obsessed with domination, Bruce Lee showed something radical. Control is stronger than force. Adaptation is stronger than tradition. Understanding is stronger than ego. That's why modern martial arts look the way they do. Why mixed disciplines exist. Why fighters cross-train. Why flexibility matters more than rigidity. Bruce Lee didn't just challenge Chuck Norris. He challenged the future. And the future listened. Today, decades later, the names remain. The legend remains. The lesson remains. Because true mastery doesn't need a trophy. It leaves an impact. And that impact doesn't fade. Bruce Lee didn't change martial arts by fighting harder. He changed it by thinking deeper. If you believe legacy is built through wisdom, not ego, type legacy. And tell me, what lesson from Bruce Lee still applies to life today? Years passed, but the moment never faded. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris went on with their lives, their careers, their paths. Films were made. Titles were won. Fame grew. But that quiet encounter, the one without an audience, without violence, without ego, continued to echo because it represented something rare. A moment where strength didn't need to be proven. In today's world, power is loud. It demands attention. It insists on victory. Bruce Lee represented the opposite. He believed the greatest battles were internal, against fear, against rigidity, against the need to dominate. That's why his influence spread far beyond martial arts. Athletes studied him, not for techniques, but for mindset. Actors studied him, not for fame, but for presence. Leaders studied him, not for control, but for adaptability. Bruce Lee didn't teach people how to fight. He taught them how to think. That's what made the encounter with Chuck Norris so powerful. Two men at the top of their craft didn't clash to prove superiority. They paused to understand. That pause changed everything. Because in that pause lived confidence. Not the fragile kind that needs applause, but the quiet kind that stands on truth. Bruce Lee understood something many never do. When you truly know your abilities, you don't need to announce them. Chuck Norris understood it too. That's why he never spoke about that moment as a loss or victory. He spoke about it as a lesson. And lessons last longer than wins. Bruce Lee's philosophy was simple, but difficult. Don't be trapped by form. Don't worship tradition blindly. Don't confuse repetition with mastery. Instead, adapt, observe, evolve. Those ideas shape modern martial arts. Mixed disciplines, fluid movement, real-world application. All of it traces back to Bruce Lee asking one question. What actually works? That question applies far beyond fighting. In life, people cling to habits that no longer serve them. Beliefs that once helped, but now limit. Systems that reward conformity over growth. Bruce Lee challenged all of that. He didn't reject tradition. He refined it. He didn't dismiss strength. He redirected it. And that's why his legacy still feels modern. Even now, decades later, his words resonate because they're not about combat. They're about awareness. Be adaptable. Be honest. Be present. The encounter with Chuck Norris symbolized that truth. Two men could have chosen ego. They could have escalated. They could have turned the moment into spectacle. They didn't. They chose respect. And in doing so, they showed what real mastery looks like. It's not loud. It's not reckless. It doesn't need validation. Real mastery is calm under pressure, open to learning, unthreatened by another's strength. That's why Bruce Lee remains a reference point. Not because he was unbeatable, but because he was undeniable. He didn't dominate the room. He elevated it. And Chuck Norris, a legend in his own right, recognized that immediately. That mutual recognition is what turned a simple encounter into mythology. Because myths aren't built on exaggeration alone. They're built on truth that feels universal. Every generation finds itself in that story. The moment where ego could win, but wisdom steps in. The moment where force could speak, but silence teaches more. Bruce Lee didn't leave behind a record of fights. He left behind a way of thinking. And that way of thinking continues to challenge people today. Are you rigid or adaptable? Are you reacting or responding? Are you proving or improving? That's the real fight Bruce Lee cared about. And that's why his legend doesn't fade. Bruce Lee's greatest weapon wasn't his speed. It was his mind. If you believe true power comes from self-mastery, type discipline. And tell me, what part of Bruce Lee's philosophy do you live by today? The world Bruce Lee lived in was different. No social media. No viral clips. No constant noise demanding attention. And yet, somehow, his message feels more relevant now than ever. Today, everyone is challenged. Not in dojos, but in conversations, in careers, in identity, in pressure. People are constantly proving, defending, comparing. Bruce Lee warned against that long before it became a problem. He understood that the loudest response is rarely the strongest one. That constant reaction weakens clarity. That ego clouds judgment. The encounter with Chuck Norris wasn't just about martial arts. It was about restraint. Two powerful men stood in a moment where escalation was possible, even expected. They didn't take it. That choice mirrors the challenges people face every day now. When disrespected, when misunderstood, when tested, react or respond. Bruce Lee believed reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. Reaction comes from fear. Response comes from control. That distinction is everything. In modern life, people fight invisible battles, online arguments, career competition, personal insecurity. Bruce Lee's philosophy offers a different approach. Observe first. Understand the situation. Adapt instead of attacking. That doesn't mean weakness. It means awareness. Bruce Lee was never passive. He was precise. He knew when to move. And when stillness was the strongest move of all. That's why his ideas resonate with athletes, entrepreneurs, artists, and leaders today. Because success no longer belongs to the loudest. It belongs to the most adaptable. Rigid systems break. Flexible ones evolve. Bruce Lee lived that truth. He didn't let labels define him. Not Chinese martial arts. Not Western boxing. Not traditional fencing. He studied everything. Then he filtered. That mindset is survival today. Careers change. Industries shift. Certainty disappears. The people who thrive aren't the strongest or the fastest. They're the ones who adapt without losing themselves. Bruce Lee's lesson wasn't be water because it sounded poetic. It was practical. Water doesn't resist unnecessarily. It flows around obstacles. It finds openings. It wears down what cannot change. That's intelligence in motion. The encounter with Chuck Norris proved something quietly profound. Two strong identities don't need to collide to validate themselves. They can coexist. Learn. Respect. That idea feels rare today. People confuse confidence with dominance. Strength with volume. Leadership with control. Bruce Lee rejected that entirely. He believed leadership begins internally. That mastery of self precedes mastery of any skill. That's why his words still circulate, still inspire, still challenge. Because they ask uncomfortable questions. Who are you when no one is watching? How do you respond under pressure? Do you cling or do you adapt? Those questions define character. Bruce Lee never claimed perfection. He claimed curiosity. And curiosity is powerful. It keeps you growing. It keeps you humble. It keeps you dangerous, in the best sense of the word. The encounter with Chuck Norris wasn't a conclusion. It was a mirror, a reflection of what's possible when ego steps aside. That mirror still exists today, in every disagreement, every challenge, every moment where you're tempted to react instead of respond. Bruce Lee's legacy isn't about fists. It's about awareness. And awareness, once gained, can't be taken away. That's why his legend survives generations. Not because he defeated others, but because he mastered himself. Bruce Lee didn't teach people how to win fights. He taught them how to win themselves. If this message still matters today, type awareness. And tell me, what situation in life requires more control than force right now? Long after the stories were told, after the films were watched, after the quotes were shared and reshared, one truth remained. Greatness is rarely loud. People often imagine legends as moments of explosion, a knockout, a final blow, a clear winner standing over another. But the Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris encounter tells a different story, a truer one. Nothing shattered, no one fell, no victory pose was struck. Yet something far more powerful happened. Two men stood at the peak of their abilities and chose humility over dominance. That choice is what made the moment timeless. Bruce Lee understood that the strongest people don't need to overpower others. They don't need to humiliate. They don't need to prove. They already know that inner knowing creates calm, and calm creates clarity. Chuck Norris recognized that immediately. That's why their encounter ended not with rivalry, but with respect. Because respect is the language of masters. In a world that constantly pushes comparison, Bruce Lee refused to compete in shallow ways. He wasn't interested in being better than someone else. He was interested in being truer to himself. That distinction matters. It's the difference between chasing validation and building substance. Bruce Lee built substance. He questioned everything, even himself. And that's what separated him. Most people stop growing once they feel competent. Bruce Lee kept evolving even when he was already exceptional. That's rare, and it's uncomfortable. Growth demands uncertainty. It demands humility. It demands the courage to admit you don't know everything. Bruce Lee lived there. The encounter with Chuck Norris wasn't about proving superiority. It was about testing reality. What works? What fails? What adapts? Those questions don't have final answers. They require constant exploration. That's why Bruce Lee never claimed to have arrived. He believed arrival was stagnation. Instead, he chose movement. Mental, physical, philosophical. And Chuck Norris respected that deeply. Because true strength recognizes true strength, even when it looks different. That lesson extends far beyond martial arts. In life, people confuse confidence with aggression. They confuse leadership with control. They confuse strength with noise. Bruce Lee dismantled those illusions. He showed that confidence can be quiet. Leadership can be gentle. Strength can be still. That's why his presence felt so powerful. He didn't fill rooms with volume. He filled them with focus. People felt it. Even decades later, people still feel it. Because the principles he lived by don't expire. Adaptation, awareness, discipline, respect. These aren't techniques. They're foundations. The encounter with Chuck Norris symbolized a higher level of understanding, where competition dissolves into curiosity, where ego gives way to insight, where mastery recognizes mastery. That's the level most people never reach. Not because they lack talent, but because they fear humility. Bruce Lee embraced it, and that's why his legacy doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to anyone willing to look inward, anyone willing to choose growth over pride, understanding over reaction, control over chaos. The story survives not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest. And honesty resonates longer than spectacle. Bruce Lee didn't leave behind a checklist for greatness. He left behind a mindset, a reminder that the most important opponent is within, that the loudest battles are often the least meaningful, that real victory is alignment with truth. And Chuck Norris, standing across from him, recognized that truth in silence. That recognition, shared without words, is what made the moment eternal. No footage needed, no proof required, because legends don't need evidence. They leave impact. Bruce Lee didn't show the world how to fight harder. He showed how to live wiser.